thank you everyone for being here today. Just as a quick reminder, we are recording this session and we'll be sharing it on our website for anyone that isn't able to join. Yeah, with that, I will turn it over to our presenters, our colleagues Mike Lamb and Sarah Phillips.
Great. Hello, everybody. It's great to see you. We are really excited to be here with everyone. We have a number of partnerships on our team that we manage. So we are really excited to be able to talk to some great partners from the DCPS community. I'm going to share my screen here to get us going. And we have some content that we're going to go through to really ground ourselves in the science of learning and development in particular. But since we have a group this size, I hope we can have a real conversation and we can ask lots of questions and dig in and all that kind of stuff. So that's the beauty of a group this size. So hopefully we get some more folks, but with this, we can really dig in on whatever you're curious about. So we'll kick off and get started here. My name is Mike Lamb, and I'm our Deputy Chief of Learning and Development Sciences. And I got my colleague, Sarah Phillips, who was going to be particularly in the chat, but can join in with anything as well with our group that we have. Just a quick agenda. We'll have a little bit of an SEL opener, social emotional learning opener, for us to connect and ground ourselves in our own experiences. Then we'll get into some of the science that we like to dive into. And then we'll share a little bit about DCPS Becoming, which is kind of our response to that science and some of our historical trends. And hopefully we can have a discussion all along the way. So first, just to start off, what is DCPS Becoming? DCPS Becoming is our transformation effort towards becoming a whole child-centered anti-racist school system. And that really grounds in these dual truths. One, DCPS has been recognized as the fastest improving district in the country for the last decade, and yet still has significant disparities for students of color, special education students, and English language learners. And so those disparities are not the result of the inherent deficits in our students. They're the direct result of our systems and practices. And so DCPS Becoming is our transformation effort to try and use the science of what we know help students learn and develop, our racial equity lens to call out our own practices, and to try and shift our entire system and our individual schools towards maximizing the potential of each and every student. So that's our broader scope of what DCPS Becoming is, the broader charge. And we'll get into some of the specifics a little bit, but it's essentially three priorities. The first is we want to embed these practices into our primary systems. So we need to actually shift the system with what we now know. The second is we need to codify school-level practices that create a supportive learning environment and developmental relationships which are the most key ingredients to learning. And we need to make sure that schools aren't left to their own devices or trying to figure it out. We actually know what works from the science now, and we can codify those practices. And then the third part is we need to build our own team's capacity, our school teams, our central offices team's capacity to be able to actually apply these practices in their own work. So those are the three major priorities for DCPS Becoming. So to get us started, we want to have an opportunity to just connect with your own experiences as a young person and think about someone in your life who you still remember. There's a wonderful book called The Ones We Remember that has stories of relationships between students and the adults in their life, often educators. And wanted to just pause here and give folks an opportunity to think about an educator, an adult that you remember. What made that adult feel supportive to you? And how did they communicate that they cared to you? How did they show it? What did it feel like? What words did they say? How did they interact with you? So we'll pause here and just give an opportunity for folks to just share either in the chat or come off mute because we've got a small group here, just to connect with and share that one you remember. And while folks are thinking, I'll start from my own experience. My educator I always remember is Mr. Harris. He was my first black male teacher that I had in 6th grade, and he brought his full self to school every single day. And not only did we get to benefit from all of his experiences, but we also were empowered to bring our full selves to school. We also talked about social studies, which was the class, but he wove in our own personal identities to all of that. And that relationship, that trust that we formed, made all the learning come to life. And so the educator that I always remember was Mr. Harris. So I would love to hear any of you all want to share the one you remember if someone stands out from your own experiences. Feel free to come off mute. All right. Is that Charisma with your hand up?
Yes, the
All right.
educator I will always remember is Mrs. Dye. She was my 8th grade history teacher. And what I loved about her was she is unapologetically authentic. And she also never let us believe that we couldn't achieve difficult things. She always had high expectations and never gave us an out. I always appreciated her for that.
I love that. I love that. Um, Thinking about the combination of that support along with really high expectations. A lot of folks call that warm demanders. And so love that experience. And Katie, I see you in the chat as well, your piano teacher. Um, June, September, April. I love that. Unforgettable in many ways, obviously. But that's great. I love that. Anyone else want to share a story from an educator they remember?
Which is one thing I've reflected on growing up is a lot of times my favorite teachers ended up being the teachers you were like afraid to get, and you're like, oh man, I got Miss or Mr. So and so, like they're so mean. And then they end up being your favorite teacher because of that warm demander piece. And you get into their classroom and they expect a lot from you, but they really value you. And I can really identify that pattern, going through school.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially if that's combined with some support, as we'll see from the science here in a minute. I see some other folks typing in the chat. Feel free to share more stories as we go here. And we'll use that kind of frame of reference about those experiences that we remember, those educators that we remember, to then think about the system that we inherit. And it's really important for us before we jump into the science to really acknowledge the historic design of our system. Um, the actual principles that were used to design our system were some of the ones you see here in the actual founding documents of our education system and the people who are influencing the design. And the first one is that most students are average and that talent is scarce and white and male. And those principles were key to the formation of our system and how it was designed. The second one is that schools should be sorting mechanisms. That if there's only a few talented people, then schools should be designed to figure out who those few talented people are and focus on them as opposed to everybody else. Um, and then if students are selected as learners, the talented few, then the system can pump them with resources and supports and cheer them on and give them all sorts of privileges. And then supposedly their success or failure was the result of their own merit because we picked the right ones. And ultimately, if only a few students get a quality education, that was more important for the success of our system, of our country, than equality, let alone equity. And so the vestiges of this historic design are still very clear today. And it's important for us to acknowledge the design of that system if we are to think about how it must shift. So we always want to start here by acknowledging the components of the design of our system and how that plays out today. Since we have a smaller group, I want to just pause here and just see which one of these design principles resonates for you all right now as you think about our system and how it needs to shift and change. Are there any of these that feel like, ooh, that really feels like my experience when I was a young person growing up, or ooh, yeah, that really resonates with some of the changes that I'm advocating for now as an adult? Keisha, yeah, come on in.
I think I'm sitting with most students are average, and success or failure is solely a result of merit, are like two that are sitting with me.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sticking with that first one, because that is the one that is in most direct conflict with what we know from brain science and the science of learning and development. That actually every single person has skills that exist in a potential state. Every single young person has skills just waiting to be activated by favorable learning conditions. And some of those educators that you were thinking about and sharing in the chat were able to create those favorable learning conditions to maximize your potential. And so we don't have to cross our fingers and hope that only, that every single child is a learner. We actually know from the science now that every single child learns and every brain develops. And so that's what the science says. So that's the kind of competing idea that we're now designing our system for, in contrast with the historic design. And so our whole mission, our whole work should be to try and figure out what creates the most favorable learning conditions, because we know when a young person exists in favorable conditions, their potential can be realized. And we know that the science tells us that that favorable set of conditions is called context. The environment, our experiences, and our relationships. And those actually drive our biology, the expression of our genes, and thus our ability to reach our full potential. So it is the experiences that we have in school. It is the relationships that we have with our teacher, with our peers, and that actually activate our genetic makeup and drive our biology. And so that's the science that we're going to dive into a little bit today, and how we're trying to apply that science to our work every day. So there's a couple of key principles when you're thinking about whole child design. The first is what we were just talking about, which is context matters, and we're going to dive into that a bunch more in a moment. The second is that learning is integrated, meaning that you don't have an academic brain and then everything else. You have social skills and social experiences, and you have emotions and emotional skills, and you have academic skills and cognitive skills, and they're all happening inside the same brain at the same time. So learning is truly an integrated experience, and so we need to redefine what learning actually looks like. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. But first, we're going to dive a bunch more into context and the role that context plays. So we now know from the Human Genome Project that there's about 20,000 genes in each of us, not significant disparities or differences amongst us by background, geography, race, etc. But the reality is that only fewer than 10% of them get expressed over the course of our lives. So the question then becomes, what makes it into that 10%? What decides whether a part of your genetic makeup gets activated and expressed throughout the course of your life? And the answer is context. So the experiences that we have, the environment that we're in, the relationships that we have activate parts of our genetic makeup that we already had and help us reach our full potential. So that's what the science says, and why it's so important for us to pay attention to context, that it is those experiences that decide what gets activated for us. As we see what this looks like in the first years of life, you can notice some differences between birth and 6 years old. So we'd love for someone to just come off mute real quick, and welcome to the folks who have just joined. We're getting all into the brain science right now. So just see, what do you notice in the differences in that brain scan of neural pathways and dendrites between birth and 6 years old? What do you notice in the differences between those two scans? Feel free to come off mute and just share. What do you notice?
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm
Yeah,
Seattle Savoy.
testing my weight time. I've got it good.
I was like, we're all scared to get the wrong answer, but I guess it's a safe
No,
space.
there's learning. Yeah, exactly. I love that vulnerability.
So it looks like from birth to 6 years, you see more um on the brain scan than you
Yeah,
do at the time of birth, but then you also see things start to change at at 14 years old. There seems to be less um, showing on the graph. Somebody help
yeah.
me piggyback off
No,
my
you're
start.
great. I love it. You did a great job. And I have a 4-year-old, and Sarah has a young one too. And we see this every single day. We see every single day all sorts of experiences shaping their development, all of these relationships, the environment that they're in, just pouring into their brain as they're trying to make sense of the world. And so between birth and 6 years old, there's this huge input of new pathways in the brain that are being formed. When you have a new experience, there's a new connection in your brain that says, this person is safe. This activity is interesting. I like the taste of that food. Those are new, actually, pathways in your brain that are formed for you to then be able to remember that the next time you experience something similar. So we've kind of heard, some of us might have heard that the first 3 years of life in particular are really important. But what we don't often hear about is that adolescence, those teenage years, is a time of second most brain development in your entire life. And so it's really important for us to think of that as a huge opportunity. And between 6 and 14, you're right, there's a lot of change that's happening. And there's some pruning that's happening, which means you are actually pruning away some of those pathways that you learned in the early years because you realize, oh, I haven't seen that happen again. That's not really a pattern that I'm recognizing. And so I don't think I actually need that learning anymore. And I'm a little overloaded here, so I'm going to prune away things that I don't need. But what also happens between 6 and 14 is that you are proliferating the things that you do need. So you are flooding the brain and doubling down on things that you do need based on your experiences that you've had. So all this is happening in the developing brain. And you can imagine a young person who has experienced lots of trust and who has experienced a really safe and predictable environment. And they show up to a pre-K3 classroom on the first day, and they're open to new people, and they're open to having new friendships, and they're trying new things. And new building blocks are opportunities to experiment and learn, and a narrative can get formed about them that, oh, they're just a natural. They're so young. What else could it be? They're just a natural learner, a natural relationship builder, as opposed to the environment that they may have been in that fostered their development in that way. And similar, you can imagine for another student who's experienced lots of stress, lots of unpredictability. Figures and adults don't necessarily keep them safe all the time. And new experiences might be risky, might come with some threats, some high stakes. And so I enter into that classroom and I might be hypervigilant. I might be sensitive to new things. I might be skeptical of adults. And we then say, oh, they're just tough to work with. I don't know if they're a learner. And we start to have these narratives be formed about their potential as if it's who they innately are, as opposed to the experiences that we have from the moment of our birth on. So it's important for us to think about the science of what's happening so that we can think about how we can maximize potential. And all of this is happening inside a developing brain. And there's 3 parts of the brain that are really critical for learning. In a healthy developmental context, you have the hippocampus, which is in charge of learning and memory, PARC scores, now called CAPE. All that stuff that you want to plant for long-term memory sits in the hippocampus. And then you also have the prefrontal cortex, which is in charge of executive function, not forgetting your backpack at home, not leaving your pencil in your previous class, being able to plan your time, being able to pay attention and focus. That prefrontal cortex is actually still developing until you're 25 or 26 years old. So there's a long path of development for the prefrontal cortex, and all of that in a healthy developmental context. You're able to use those things and they develop. However, if you are experiencing stress, particularly toxic stress, because of adversity that you've experienced or even trauma that you've experienced as a young person, there's another part of the brain that's critical. And this is called the amygdala. And the amygdala remembers every single stressful experience you've ever had in your life. And we are so glad that it does, because when something threatening happens again, it can activate that memory and react instantaneously to the perceived threat that we have. So it is really, really helpful that we have a part of our brain that kicks into gear when we're experiencing threat. And I remember there was a moment where I was walking my daughter across the street, and I had thought I had looked both ways. And I looked back to one side, and I saw a car zooming at us. And I pulled her out of the way and yanked her to the ground, and thinking I had just saved the day. Whew. Thinking about it right now. Um, and yet, when I looked over, it was just a parked car. But in that moment, in that split second, my amygdala took over. The stress response system kicked into gear. It flooded my brain and my body with cortisol, the stress hormone, and it took over and said, "We are going to be in charge. We're the captains of the ship. We're going to help you survive and keep you safe." And it's great if there's a zooming car at you and you don't have to sit there and think about the make or the model of the car, or how angry the driver feels, or whether they're paying attention or not. You're not looking for those things. You're just acting and reacting. So it's great if you're in that situation, or you're in the forest and you see a bear. But in the hallways of a high school during a transition, or a cafeteria, or if someone says something to you during class, that same part of your brain and your body can get triggered and activated to take over in those moments, and to essentially have a threat response system kick into gear. And so often we hear about bad kids, bad behavior, bad choices, as opposed to us thinking about what are the signs and signals of a young person experiencing stress. Because if we are able to actually have our lens applied to that, then we have a totally different type of response that we can have, that's much more effective and will ultimately lead to learning for the long term. So it's the part of the brain that's interacting here, that's so important for us to think about, because the amygdala not only takes over in times of stress, but it also turns off the rest of the brain, because all of our focus and all of our attention needs to be on survival. And so the part of our brain in charge of long-term memory, not available to us. So for those of you that have stressful experiences speaking in public, or if you have a big meeting or a big presentation or something like that, and you're very stressed, maybe your heart's beating fast, your palms are sweaty, you have dry mouth, and after someone goes, "How was that big meeting earlier today or yesterday?" And you're like, "I don't remember anything. I just got through it." In part, that's because your hippocampus may not have actually been available to you, and you might have actually blacked out in that moment. And so it's important for us to think about, for young people who are experiencing that same stress, that same lack of connection and belonging, they're walking around our classrooms, our schools, without access to their hippocampus or their prefrontal cortex. Now, in a minute, we'll talk about how we can shift all of this and change all of this according to the science. But I just want to pause here and to see if there's any questions or thoughts or what resonates here as you're thinking about what's going on inside the developing brain of a child. Feel free to just come off mute. We're a smaller group. No need to raise your hand or anything like that. Just come on in.
I mean, I think it's not surprising when we think about, I mean, what's coming up for me right now is just like even thinking about fight and fight response.
Yeah.
And so like even as an adult, navigating traumas that we might see, witness, participate, whatever, like it's no surprise that our own productivity or how we like receive the world can shift. And so recognizing like for a younger mind that's still healing, still growing, like how much those trauma responses do impact learning, productivity, care, connection with folks. And so it's just interesting to put it in that context, because I don't think we always spend enough time. Like I think we put too much on young people, that they're little humans, but we forget that they are little humans. And so I think that's just like really helpful to have that context.
Can I piggyback off that,
Yeah,
off of Keisha?
go for
So,
it.
so I agree, 100%. And just when you shared your story about like that car coming, I think as young people, as we walk, my work is focused on students who are dropped out, or helping them get back on track in school, and young people in safety. And so when you think about like that experience that your daughter or your child went through, like kind of being scared and kind of like some of our kids experience that every day on their routes to and from school, just their outside environment. And then we expect them to show up at the school and like, hey, let's talk about English and math. And so this is really important, for me, and I know it's for educators to kind of keep this in perspective as we are, welcoming and serving students in the community. So spot on, Keisha. I'm with you 100%. Just wanted to kind of add that on.
Yeah, I really appreciate both of your thoughts, in part because they are young people who are still developing, right? And also we are adults. Even this morning, I got home really late from a conference in California last night. I was stressed this morning. I had meetings early. I was trying to get out of my house, and I forgot my garage opener that I need to be able to park my bike to get my daughter back in later today. Now, I could be seen as forgetful and not having my act together, or I could just recognize that I was feeling a lot of stress and I didn't have access to the parts of my brain I needed to remember the things that I need for executive function skills, like time management, managing my belongings, etc. And so the narrative that we tell about a young person who is experiencing stress is really important, because we can often say there's something wrong with them. We can often say that they don't have potential, or they're making bad choices, they're behaving badly, or we can think about the impact that stress might be having on them. And we can actually think that we actually want them to be responding in a stress response system manner much of the time in their experiences. It's actually really helpful and healthy for them to be vigilant and perceiving threat where it is. But we need to create a context in schools and classrooms where we are earning their trust, and we are telling them that here is safe, emotionally and physically, and that when they enter our building, they can have a transformative experience. Because as y'all were saying, I'll just skip ahead to this visual for us to think about. They have a backpack of experiences that they're bringing to school. And they don't drop that backpack off at the door and say, hey, the school version of me is here. I'm ready for learning, right? Because that backpack is their brain, and they're carrying around whatever stressful experiences they've had last night, a week ago, a year ago, 5 years ago. And so the question for us is, what greets that young person on the other side of that door? And now we know from the science, research, that we can create a context that overpowers and transforms the stress that they've experienced so that they can be ready for learning and productivity. And so we think about these moments in a school, and this is more than just a hug. In this moment, there's neurotransmitters, serotonin and dopamine, that are firing in both the young person and the adult in this moment, right? And whatever stress, whatever cortisol that the young person and the adult had walking in is now overpowered by the love hormone oxytocin. And the reason why all this brain research is a good news, optimistic story is that oxytocin is more powerful than cortisol. Meaning, when you experience someone that you have a lot of trust with, when you experience a relationship that you feel really connected to, oxytocin floods the brain and the body and overpowers cortisol and reduces the level of cortisol in your body. And we know this to be true from our own lives. There's that person that when you're feeling stressed, when you're feeling like you're worried or you're frustrated, and you call them on the phone. And the moment that you hear their voice, you start to feel a little calmer. You can start to think a little clearly. And by the end of that conversation, you can be self-reflective, you can be creative, you can come up with new strategies. All of that is because that level of oxytocin you just got is opening back up the parts of your brain you need to think, to remember, to learn, to be creative, to regulate your emotions, etc. So all of that is happening inside our brains when we're experiencing stress, and when we're experiencing support. And so that's what's happening in these kinds of moments. And there's tons of really powerful research around this too. Even just those little moments as a student is walking in the door to the school, walking in the door to a classroom can have a huge difference. We have a strategy that we work on called warm welcome, and that's the first couple of minutes of the day, spending time having that connection with students as they come in. And there's research, really powerful research that I linked to in this slide if you want to click on it, that shows that just that warm welcome, that greeting at the door, 5-7 seconds of interaction, increases academic engagement by 20 points and decreases behavioral challenges by 9 points. And over the course of a whole day, that's an extra hour of learning just from that moment of connection. And we're like, how could that be so important? But if we go back to the science and we think about a young person experiencing stress, and they have that moment of connection, we look each other in the eyes, we feel like we belong, we're welcomed here in this space by this adult, and we then have that oxytocin flood our brain and our body, open back up, learning and self-regulation. So there's really powerful research around this as well. In addition to the power of a developmental relationship, that deep relationship that a young person and an adult have that we talked about earlier. And in middle school students in particular, there's research showing that they were 8 times more likely to stick with challenging tasks, to enjoy working hard, and to know it's okay to make mistakes if they had a developmental relationship with their teacher. 8 times, like that's not 8% or 80%. It's 8 times, 800% more likely to do those things if you have that developmental relationship. And so we're seeing this data bear out in our own schools and DCPS as well. In the x-axis here of this scatter plot chart is our sense of belonging metric through our panorama survey. And then on the y-axis, we have our PARCC scores, and each dot represents a school that serves 3rd through 5th graders. And you can see there's a real connection between belonging and PARCC scores. In fact, that line is for every 1 point increase on belonging, there's a 2-point increase on PARCC scores, which is a really powerful relationship. And even in the 6th through 12th grade context, that same relationship holds 1 to 2 in there as well. And as we think about the existence of relationship structures and practices, there are no schools that have low relationship scores, low relationship practices, and even 20% on PARCC, let alone 30, 40, 50, 60. There's no schools on the top left of that chart. So this work is really powerful, and there's lots of research around it, and we're seeing it in our own schools. And this is why creating this whole child approach and this warm, welcoming place of belonging and safety is so critical for what we're seeing. We're also seeing this at critical junctures in a student's experience as well. So what we noticed is that between 5th and 6th grade, there's about a 3-point drop off in all of our SEL indicators, like rigorous expectations, like feeling prepared, feeling challenged, etc. There's about 3-point difference between 5th and 6th grade, except for belonging. There is a 17-point drop in belonging between 5th and 6th grade, and it never recovers. You see at the bottom of that graph in 12th grade, it never recovers. So as they think about what is it about how we talk about middle school, how we talk about 6th grade, that can be particularly jarring. And I taught in a pre-K through 8th grade school on the south side of Chicago. And so my first instinct was, oh, it's because we have standalone middle schools. That's the big thing. But when we actually looked under the hood of that, it's still the case for 6th graders in pre-K through 8 schools in DCPS and education campuses. And so there's something about how we talk about middle school, how we talk about the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade experience that shifts students from feeling that warmth, that safety, that belonging, that connection, to now feeling like, oh, this is going to be something different. I have to be prepared for something hard. And so we're getting under the hood of that and thinking about what should the 6th grade experience look like. And we have 6th grade academies that we've launched this year, where all of that is the focus, where 6th grade academies are focusing on students' connection, belonging, and academic readiness as they have that middle school experience. So we are really prioritizing the 6th grade experience based on our data. So I wanted to pause here again and just give an opportunity for anyone to ask questions or talk about any of this that's resonating as you're thinking about some of this data and research about the connection between belonging and learning. We saw the science, we saw what's happening in the brain, and now we see some of the data and the research that's bearing this out. So any thoughts, questions? Folks want to come on in?
Mike, do you think that the drop in middle school that carries through to high school would exist sort of not regardless of what's going on at the school, because there's certainly things that we can do to build those things back up, but is it also part of just adolescence and a natural feeling of not necessarily fitting in because you're changing and everybody else is changing? Like, how much can be corrected for, I guess, for lack of a better
Yeah,
word?
I think it's a great question. I think I would start off with the science that we just learned, that in order for learning to happen, students need to feel safe, connected, and belonging. And in the middle school experience, students are absolutely asking questions about their identity. They're trying to figure out who they are in this world, let alone in this school or this classroom. And so it's even more important that we prioritize it given what we saw. And in a moment, I'll share an example of a school that's leaning into this work in really powerful ways and completely transforming their data and transforming the student experience as a result of that. But it is, in fact, because of those questions and those wonderings that middle school students have that we need the middle school experience to be particularly one of belonging, and the high school experience. Think about the words that we've traditionally used. This is going to be hard. I have so many kids. We're not going to be able to have a relationship. It's different. You're on your own. Even the language and the way we talk about it makes a student feel like, oh, this is going to be different than my entire educational experience so far. I'm not going to get what I need. I guess I'm not going to get the support and connection that have helped me be successful to this point, right? So even when we try and prepare students by saying those things, we're actually making it much less likely that they will learn because we're making them feel like they're not going to be able to connect, trust, and have a relationship moving forward. So, and all this is not only the language we use, but it's also the practices that we have too. Other thoughts or connections as we think about the data between belonging, relationships, and actual learning? Cool. So all of this is why we have launched DCPS Becoming the last 3 years. Now that we have this research, this data, we are obligated to actually act and apply all this science to everything that we're doing. And so that's why we have a strategy to embed this work in our systems, to codify the school level practices, and to build staff capacity to support them in this work. And Sarah led the development of our tools that I'll mention here in a moment as we think about codifying those school level practices. So we're going to dive into that here for a moment. And the research has called out 5 core practices, is what we're calling them. Expectations, norms, and routines for predictability and safety in school building. Co-regulatory and restorative practices. So adults feel like it is their job, it is their responsibility to co-regulate with students when they're feeling stressed and not escalate. Trust building interactions between adults and students and students and students. Student relationship structures, so that's that predictable place where if I'm going to school today, I know I'm going to have an opportunity to connect with my peers. And then in intervention and enrichment structures that are holistic so that students can be supported when they need that extra level of support. So these are the core practices that we've gone all in on and spent a ton of time researching. And so I want to play a video real quick to share exactly what this work looks like at a school, Johnson Middle School. And I'll share some data about Johnson in a moment as well. But wanted to give you all a taste of what this work looks like. So hopefully this video will work. Abby, can you give me a thumbs up if you hear volume? Okay, yeah. Awesome. So that was a taste of a school and an educator who has gone all in on the science, all in on our core practices. And yeah, exactly. This is the good stuff. And has had a transformative impact in the data. So when you look at their sense of belonging at Johnson Middle School, they have gone from the 38th of 48 secondary schools in DCPS to the 4th in just 1 year. And now they are in the 99th percentile nationally for urban middle schools in sense of belonging. So to your question, Abby, you can transform this work by intentionally doing specific practices that are born in the research, and you can have a huge impact on the learning environment in just 1 year even. And so we are going all in on this work. Yes, agree, Katie. Johnson team is fantastic. And so we wanted to share just an example of what this work looks like and feels like and some of the data that comes out of there. So we also are then starting to build the capacity of staff across DCPS to do this. And we've launched a pilot of 40 schools who have all raised their hands across DCPS wanting to go all in on this work. And so we have about 21 schools that are supported by Transcend, which is a partner of ours. And they have created a whole child model that was born at Van Ness and that has the same practices that we're talking about in Becoming. And they're getting support and coaching every single day in those cohorts. A few of them have launched 3 or 4 years ago, and a few have launched just this fall. And so you can see the schools all across the district. And then our Becoming School support, schools that are getting direct coaching and support from our team as well. And so these schools represent all grade levels, all wards across DCPS who are saying this work is really important. We want to go all in on this, and we want our team to build their capacity to be able to create that kind of context and learning environment that's really critical. So all of that is the capacity building work and the data that we're seeing just in the first year or two from schools that are particularly going all in on this. So I wanted to see if there are any questions or thoughts or wonderings about those practices that we're talking about, or about the pilot and the schools that have raised their hands so far.
I had a question. So would you say like Johnson is beating the odds? Like if you look at the schools compared to like the same demographics in the same area with the same makeup, and you look at their school makeup, would you say that that's a school that you would say, yeah, they're actually beating the odds by having these coaching and services and supports?
Yeah, well, two things, and I promise we didn't talk in advance about teeing me up for what I'm going to say next.
Okay.
But I would say, yes, I mean, you look 99th percentile nationally for urban middle schools, absolutely beating the odds. But we can't just continue to ask children to beat the odds. We have to use the science, use the research to actually change the odds themselves, because we know that if you do these things, the odds change. And so we need to get to a place where it is actually likely for a student at Johnson or at Kramer or another school to have a really wonderful, belonging-filled, safe, calm, predictable experience at school. And thus, their learning that comes as a result of that is not beating the odds. We've actually changed the odds themselves, so it's likely that that happens in our schools and classrooms. So that's the shift that I think we need to make as a system from applauding the individual stories of individual schools that beat the odds to actually fundamentally changing the odds themselves. So great prompt.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
So nice to meet you, and
Yes.
very, very exciting information. My name is Beth Carr. I'm with Beable Life Ready Literacy. We're a DCPS partner. How, as a vendor that was not part of this original these pilots that you have going in this work that you're doing, how can we get involved in that? How can we engage? As I'm listening to you talk, I'm seeing so many incredible connections and ways that we could be of significant value in this in your work. Like I'm
That's
so
great.
inspired. And so we're just getting started in partnering with Cardoza High School right now. And how do I get to the middle schools to help them see the connections? And is it appropriate for me to align to this work? And I would love to talk with you afterward and share what we're doing and how, the work that we're doing. I would love your feedback. It would be so exciting. Anyway, Thank you.
Yeah, I love that. That would be great. And I just spent the last couple of days actually in California with Principal Mola. So we were working really closely together, and I know he is incredibly bought into this work. And so I think there's huge opportunities for transformation at Cardoza, in addition to the redesign work that they're doing as well. So I think huge opportunity. Sarah, can you drop in the chat the science syllabus that we have so that folks can see a bunch of the readings that and videos and articles that we have from all of the work that I've referenced so far, so that you can feel like you can read up on it, get even more tuned into it. And then Abby, defer to you on all sorts of follow-ups, but I know that there's probably a dozen ways that everybody can collaborate around this work. Even just talking about the importance of this when you show up to a school is helpful for schools to understand that you get it and to reinforce this work. So that is a perfect starting point as we can then get even deeper in all of this. And Keisha, I thought I saw you coming off too.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to thank you, Beth, for that question. I think what sits with me as a partner and just community member in general is like, we're talking about system change. It's also like, how does the ecosystem support that system change? And just kind of thinking about, like, I love what you were saying, using the Johnson example of just like thinking like the dream, right, is that if all levels of DCPS are building these community aspects, then there isn't going to be a gap for young people. And I think that applies to a lot of the different intersections of the work that many of us partners are in. And so I'm a process person, and just thinking about like how, as we come into alignment as partners, not just in these one-off calls, but I appreciate Beth's note on like, how do we see ourselves aligning as partners through these different frameworks and opportunities. I think a comment / question is more just kind of thinking about, like, I'm sure there's a lot of different elements coming into place when we think about system change overall. And so I'm just wondering like how, and maybe as I dig into the syllabus, like how y'all see that like aligning with process and practice that's already in place, or like shifting process and practice that has been in place, so that we're not like reinventing the wheel, but strengthening models that are already there. So it's just a piece that I keep thinking about from like an effort of sustainability. But then to what you were saying, Beth, like where there are spaces that we as partners can lean into and support, like also seeing how we can add our strength to the vibrancy and growth of the ecosystem more wholly.
Yeah, I love that. And I think the last thing that I'll conclude on, I think, is towards exactly what you're saying. And this is the principle that learning is integrated. And as you all are doing your work, I think it's really helpful for you to be talking about the work that you're doing in the framework of learning as an integrated concept. And we need to do a ton of work in our community more broadly to redefine what learning is. And if you all are helping us do that, that would be really important, because as you see on the far left, our system was designed with a very limited view of what education was, that it was all academics. And you know, if you think of this continuum, a little further over, there might have been some people at some point who were like, you know what, behavior gets in the way, and there's bad kids, and we need to get the bad kids out so the learners can learn. And you move a little further over, and it's, well, actually, social and emotional development is important, but it's a zero-sum game. When do you have the time? So maybe I'll just have that one kid that I'll help beat the odds, right? Move a little further over into the continuum, and it's, no, SEL is important. We need to make time for SEL. And it's at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday, and then we get back to learning, right? Programatize SEL. Move a little further over, and it's, no, actually, we need to talk about relationships and social and emotional learning throughout the day because it boosts academics. It's still an in-service of relationship. But we now know from the research and the science is that all these things are happening at the same time, and you can't just focus on one. So we have to have social, emotional, and academic development all integrated by design, that every single learning experience, we're thinking about the social skills, the emotional skills, the experiences that they have, and the academic content and we are designing and building skills for those integrated three at the exact same time. And so that's where we're going. And we have a really exciting 5-year curriculum redesign project aimed at exactly that, where we have self-awareness and self-management and stress management all built into the fabric of academic experiences. So when you're doing a novel study in 8th grade, for example, you're not only asking the academic content like draw a conclusion, what's the central passage and the main idea, but you're also asking which characters are experiencing stress and which characters are good at building relationships with each other and using relationships to overcome adversity, and which characters are demonstrating agency and advocating for their own needs, right? This is how you integrate all this stuff together, and that's what kids want to talk about anyway. That's what they want to discuss, and we're saying, nope, leave that at the door, because that's not what learning is. In fact, it's the opposite. That is exactly what learning is, and we haven't been doing it. So all your help that you can do to help reframe what learning is, and thus reframe that we need to respond with an integrated approach that thinks about the learning environment and the context and the relationships, would be enormously helpful as we think about this coalition of the excited that includes all of you, to rally our DC community in this vision of where we're going.
Thank you so much, Mike and Sarah. The one other thing I wanted to say is that part of the motivation for hosting these lunch and learns was to start to develop a shared vocabulary and for partners to understand the priorities of different schools, what DCPS is focused on, so that you can have more intentional conversations with your principals, because that's where obviously the alignment is needing to happen. And so I know that the way principals approach partnerships really varies school to school, but the more you can speak their language and align your priorities with their priorities, I think it makes it easier to have more strategic conversations and, frankly, increase your value add to the principal, whose time is limited, who's getting bombarded with a lot of asks from a lot of people in and outside of DCPS. So I think today's session was awesome for many reasons, but in part because I do think we're creating this shared language around what our priorities are and which direction we're all trying to sort of turn the ship, so to speak. So I would really encourage folks to have conversations directly with the schools that you're working in, hear from them about how they're implementing this, and then how you can support. And any way that our team can support, obviously we are here for that as well.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for your great questions, for all the work that you do every day to support our young people and their families. And we are really excited about the vision that we have moving forward with you all alongside us, helping us out and pushing us. So thank you all.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.